Hello. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So, up today in this learning to adapt. So we'll be talking about animal behaviour and conservation. Up first is me. I did my PhD at ZSL in the Institute of Zoology, also at UCL. We also have Dr. Faye Clark from the University of Bristol and Professor Sam Turvey, also from IOZ as well. So, I guess I'll start off with my stuff. Looking at animal conservation in a more general overview, I just wanted to kind of introduce the event a little bit and then talk about how animal behaviour could be used as a conservation tool. Yes, I'm calling it DEFRA, which is why that's down there, because they gave me some time off to do this, which is very nice of them, so honour down there. So, my PhD at ZSL was mainly on baboons. I've done a lot of primate work. This was out in Saubis in Namibia. I worked on how information travels through a baboon troop, how they learn from each other. I did that using touch screens in a completely wild group of baboons, which are habituated to humans. I wanted to understand whether there's any barriers to spread of potentially adaptive behaviours. At ZSL, I've kind of applied that with cognitive enrichment, again, mostly with primates, doing puzzle boxes in and around everywhere. These are some of my volunteers who are now doing masters and PhDs as well. And then on the left, you can see some of my public engagement and some of my EDI work with Primate Society of Great Britain. So I will talk about my wider projects later, but for now, I'm here to talk to you about behaviour and conservation. And my first point I want to say is, if there's any kind of environmental change, even with you guys as humans, the first response anyone has is to change their behaviour. So if I tell you it's cold outside, you wear a coat. You don't wait to have children who then genetically change to have more fur. That's just a ridiculous scenario, right? So do we talk about behaviour in conservation? Well, I wanted to pull up this systematic survey, which I found while doing this talk. If you look on the x-axis, this is threats to conservation like pollution, climate change, habitat loss, etc., and some solutions like habitat restoration. And on the left-hand side there, behaviours, so threats to behaviours or at least considerations within these conservation threats. Anything which is blue is less than 10% of papers which mention these conservation threats considered the behaviour within those papers, which is extremely low considering how integral behaviour, just an animal living its life, has in conservation. There's a few different ones like connectivity and fragmentation. So if habitats aren't connected and you want them connected, you need to understand how animals disperse and migrate. That is quite commonly talked about. But this lack of discussion within climate and conservation and behaviour is a bit worrying when we're looking at money being very tight in conservation, where we need to be more pragmatic with how we spend our money, what we target things towards. So that's try and get it right is much more important when there's less and less money with things being cut and potentially being cut a lot more in the future. I wanted to mention two case studies which behaviour might have been neglected at the start of things, and I'll bring it back round. So the first one is whooping cranes in America. These were in the 1960s, there's about 50 individuals or so, about 150 or so in the 90s. And the problem with these is when you had them captively bred and raised, you didn't have individuals which learnt migration routes. These you go south towards Florida type way. And if you don't have individuals which know migration routes, how would you learn migration routes? Well, when they tried to reintroduce these in the first instance, they assumed migration routes were inherently instinctive. And obviously the cranes didn't know what the hell they were doing, so they didn't fly south during the winter, and those reintroductions didn't work. Similarly with these guys, which is black-footed ferrets, again in America, there was only 18 individuals or so in the 90s or 80s due to fur trade, diseases, stuff like that. And when they tried to reintroduce individuals after captive breeding, they kept dying from starvation and predation because they didn't know what the predators were, how to avoid them, or how to hunt prairie dogs, which they usually eat. So I'm going to go over two main themes in animal behaviour, which could have conservation applications. I spoke a little bit about migration route collapse, but how could we look at that typically? Well, protect knowledgeable individuals. That's the same going for, say, elephants. You might protect the matriarch who knows where all the waterholes are over someone who might not know where the waterholes are. Or if you don't know any knowledgeable individuals, you could maybe retrain those migration routes, which I'll come back round to. With habitat fragmentation, habitat corridors are a normal thing which you talk about connecting two different landscapes. But how do you know the animals will actually use them? Will that animal actually disperse in that direction? Does it have a reason for not going over there? So past trauma, the cars, logging, something like that. Understanding an animal's perception and movement and behavior within their ecosystem really needs to be integrated into habitat corridor planning. And also with reintroduction and translocations, you can help translocations and reintroductions by doing things softly, putting animals into an enclosure before you let them out into the full habitat, also giving them some supplementary feeding. But inherently, animals need to understand their new environment, where the water is, where their predators are, where their food is. So there needs to be some kind of integration of behavior and learning within that to ensure that animals actually survive. Same with living with humans. With human-wildlife conflict, we need to understand what animals know about humans, whether they perceive us as food, threats, or just blockages, basically. So then we can plan around that actual human-wildlife conflict from the human side, but also understanding the animal side of things. With poaching, a colleague in Portsmouth, they're looking at training elephants to avoid poachers by exposing them to gunpowder and explosive smells, so they avoid guns. Similarly, a colleague in Newcastle, they're looking at discouraging boat contacts with light and sound on fishing nets, so understanding what fish and sharks and cetaceans actually perceive or don't perceive, or discourage them, what they don't like, so that discourages bycatch. And you would have all heard about sea turtle examples where turtles, when they're hatching, they go towards the lights of bars and stuff like that behind the sea rather than out to sea where the moonlight is, because the bars are lighter than the moonlight. So WWF, for instance, parking boats outside of nests, off the shores of beaches which are illuminated so that sea turtles go out to them. But this is only two themes. There are a lot of other things which conservation threats could impact animal behaviours, and they should be considered, like disease transmission, for instance, not an obvious one. But understanding how animals interact with each other can mean you can understand how diseases spread. So for instance, gorillas, Ebola spreads much more easily through gorilla groups than it does for chimpanzee groups, simply because gorillas have more close contact than chimpanzees do. With reproductive success as well, if you're reintroducing birds which have a very specific mating song, maybe they don't learn that when they're in captivity, so they're less likely to mate with their wild counterparts. What else have we got there? Climate change, you've got range shifts, so that's pretty much the same as your migration routes, which might change your predator-prey interactions, learning what to avoid, learning what to eat. To revisit the first figure which I showed you, this is the papers which actually did include behaviour within their discussions of conservation. On the left, you can see quite a few papers in the green and the reds. They included behaviour in the threats to populations. But on the right, the blue is less numbers. They didn't typically translate a threat to animal behaviour into the solutions within their conservation strategies. So this is a weird juxtaposition where you're identifying a threat but not including in the solution. So why is that? Well, simply because you need to look at the bigger picture. That there is a lot of challenges to including behaviour within conservation policy and action. And one of the main ones, I think, is context. So applying behaviour to something which everyone behaves differently. Each animal might behave differently, each group might, each species might. So having a one-size-fits-all policy for behaviour is very difficult. And that translates into measuring and monitoring. How do you standardise measuring a behaviour, monitoring a behaviour across large populations, different countries even, different species, different groups, which all, it's not as universally applied as, say, taking a blood sample, running a PCR, anything like that, which is a lot more universally standardised and compared across these groups. and this affects things like scalability. And ethics needs to be considered as well. If you're looking at behavior, you're usually a bit more involved in that species environment. And also if you're training them to actually go on different migration routes, then you're a lot more involved in their lives rather than being away and leaving them alone to, well, survive themselves. But there are more immediate threats as well than behavior. If a population is such low numbers that their genetic diversity means they're unlikely to reproduce and survive, is behavior really your biggest interest in that? If their habitat is being destroyed, then surely that's more important than looking into behaviors. So there's a balance with all of these things. But I do want to talk to you about some successes. So are those whooping cranes? Yes, they don't know the migration routes, but we do. So in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, people flew ultralights and basically trained whooping cranes to follow them, which is quite nice, I think. In that figure up there, you can see in the reds at the bottom, they're whooping cranes which learnt off the ultralights, but the more orange ones are whooping cranes which learn the migration routes off other whooping cranes. So we've now got those knowledgeable individuals in there, and we've actually stopped doing ultralight training as of 5-10 years ago or so. And with the ferrets, this is still happening. So with captive breeding programs, before the ferrets are released into the wild, they go to ferret boot camp, and they get taught how to hunt prairie dogs and how to avoid robot badgers, such as this. And these have been quite successful. So with cranes, there's over 500 of them now in the wild, and the ferret population is 1,000. Also, we have about 7,000 released over the last 30 years. Other successes, we've got Californian condors, which are fed by puppets, minimizing human contact, and also trained to avoid power lines, which is on the right there. As ZSL, we're learning more about eel migration, so protecting the migration routes of the River Thames. That's the elephant example. And the light examples. This is training fairy wrens and New Zealand robins to understand threat calls and predator calls. And then you've got the same jungle camps with orangutans, stuff like that. Just to hit on what I'm personally interested in my research is social learning, which is learning off one another, like those whooping cranes are doing now. But I'm sure you're all aware, having all been to school, not every group learns the same way, not every individual does. So if you have groups which learn differently, then you have groups which have different behaviors. You'll have seen in chimpanzees, for instance, like nut cracking with rocks. Only one group of chimpanzees actually does that in the West. So they are differentially adapted to than other chimpanzees to, I don't know, if there's a shortage of nuts, for instance. So in the Convention of Migratory Species, which was one of the big COPs, this is recognized as culturally significant units. So West African chimpanzees and Eastern Pacific sperm whales have their special conservation actions within them that are conserved as separate entities compared to the species as a wide variety. And other considerations within this are African elephants for their migration pathways, African wild dogs as well for their prey preferences depending on populations, and humpback whales for their song cultures as well. There's about 10 to 20 other ones which came out this year as recommendations. If you're interested in animal cultures, there's a wealth of literature now. There was a nice special edition in Philosophical Transactions B, which had a few general papers, but more specific ones like primates conservation, which I'm more interested in. But how do I apply this? Well, I see a problem with looking at behavior, but particularly cultural behavior. For if you find, say, an adaptive behavior in one chimpanzee group compared to another chimpanzee group, which chimpanzee group do you prioritize if you've got not that much funding? Then how do you even translate that into different species, different behaviors? How can you possibly compare those? Quite difficult. If it's something like genetics, you can compare genetics in a more statistical, mathsy way, which I don't understand. But with behaviors, there's currently no way to kind of compare those. So how can you really decide anything in conservation? Well, I'm doing this at ZSL now, comparative social learning. So if you look at the inheritable unit, It's not genetics in how you inherit behaviors, but it's social learning. You learn off someone else. So you standardize the cognitive enrichment which you do, your cognitive task, you can potentially understand how important social learning is for groups and species and individuals, and also how they learn and in what contexts. So I've got these like puzzle boxes dotted around. You can make them more and less complex to see, well, what they can actually solve or not solve, but also, like I say, the importance of social learning in what context. Therefore, if, say, I was going to introduce this mangabe group into the wild, I can understand who learns off who. So Cassie, if she learns about the water source first, everyone else will ignore her. So it's really important to make a good learning environment for the group which you are reintroducing. Equally in the wild, for animals which have adaptive behaviors or knowledge of migration routes, they're really important to preserve those knowledge bases. And yeah, so stick around if you are in Zelsa at any point and you see puzzle boxes up. There might just be some kind of experiment happening, so please talk to one of my volunteers or anything. They'd be very happy to answer your questions. And that's it from me. Thank you. Okay, so next up is, we'll all take your questions because there's like a discussion thing afterwards, so don't worry too much. But next up is Dr. Faye Clark. She's a senior lecturer at School of Psychological Science, University of Bristol, specialising in the relationships between animal cognition and affective state. In other words, how animals think and feel. Faye, as I am, is a ZSL alumni. She was also on the Southwest Baboon Project as a field assistant, then master's and a PhD at IOZ. She also works at ZSL as an animal behaviourist, assessing primate welfare, with over 20 years of experience working with captive wildlife in zoos and research centres, particularly marine mammals and primates. She's currently working on how game-like tasks can be used to study animal cognition and act as a form of enrichment. So, welcome, Faye.
Good evening, everybody. Really happy to be here. As Simon just said, I am a ZSL alum myself, and this is quite a special year for me because it's been 20 years since I started my involvement with ZSL. So it was 20 years ago that I first was a volunteer with the Southwest Baboon Project that you've heard about already from Simon. And as he said, I've done quite a lot of my studies here, including my PhD, which I'm going to touch on a little bit as we go through. So the main species that I'm going to talk to you about, or taxonomic group, are the lemurs and just all the problems that they're facing, and how a lot of the research that I've been doing since I left ZSL has been focused on trying to merge their cognition and their conservation. So when I left ZSL, when I had my PhD in hand, I went to work for an NGO. I went to work for Bristol Zoological Society. And one of the things that I was doing as a postdoctoral researcher was red listing the lemurs. So if you don't know about the red list is it's sort of like a big catalogue of doom. So it tells us just how endangered our various biodiversity is. And this was a really depressing job. Honestly, it's probably the worst job I've ever had because I was red listing the lemurs and they are really dire in terms of the threats that they face, and the statistics are terrible. So I've just put some of the most depressing ones that I could find on this slide for you. So lemurs as a taxa, so we're talking about 112 species, are the most endangered vertebrate group that we have on the planet. 98% of lemur species are threatened with extinction. And if we think about just the period of time that I was working at Bristol Zoological Society, which was roughly 2012 to 2020, 3% more lemur species became threatened during that time. So yeah, lots of fun for me. So what is the problem with lemurs? Well, what isn't the problem? If you can think of a threat that could exist, the lemurs will be suffering from that threat. So broadly, we call this range of threats HIREC, which stands for Human-Induced Rapid Environmental Change, and this is the umbrella term that we use that covers everything that's terrible that we're doing to the planet as humans. So for the lemurs, So they're endemic to Madagascar, they're an island species, and they've evolved to live on that specific island. They encounter habitat loss, they encounter climate change, which affects the distribution and the abundance of their food sources. They're also increasingly affected by hunting and the pet trade. So this is becoming more of a problem. So traditionally, native cultures, hunting lemurs wasn't a problem, but that culture is eroding. So lemurs are being hunted and sold as pets more and more often. And then all of the introduced species that come onto Madagascar bring their nasty diseases, and the lemurs are suffering from that too. So, yeah, with all that doom and depression, I was very keen to move off the red listing team and to really try and think about applied solutions. So I am actually an animal cognition and welfare scientist by training, so I was really keen to take my own expertise of measuring, assessing animal cognition and challenging cognition and to try this for the lemurs. So I established a project. It started at Bristol Zoological Society, but has since moved with me to the University of Bristol, called Lemur Boot Camp. And you would have heard Simon a few minutes ago talk about this boot camp concept. So it's based on this idea of really challenging what animals are capable of and introducing a sort of positive type of stress. So before I talk to you about Lemur Boot Camp as a project, I just want to talk about the theory behind that, and it's connected to the title of my talk, which is The Endangered Brain. So I will try and explain very quickly what the endangered brain is. So, ex situ species conservation, so that's when we're conserving a species in captivity, could be a zoo, could be a sanctuary, tends to focus on maximising head counts. So what we tend to do is we have a zoo, we have a sanctuary, and we try and get as many individual lemurs in that facility living at any one time. And that's great, because the more lemurs we have, the more chance that we've got a nice safety net against extinction. And I'm sure you've heard that analogy before, that zoos are this safety net against extinction. But the problem is that even if we have a good number of lemurs, and even if we have a genetically diverse population of lemurs, or if we look at all the zoos, we have good genes across those zoos, we're really missing a beat here. We're not really conserving the meaningful unit, and this ties very nicely into what Simon was saying. It's all about the behaviour. It's about the cognitive skills. It's about the behavioural skills. It's about what's going up in here in the brain. So really, it's the brain that is endangered as much as it's the physical animal. We also know, so we did a really big literature review back in 2023. The paper's called The Endangered Brain, so you can go and have a look at that paper later. But we found really, really strong evidence that when you have animals in restricted or unchallenging environments, this is associated with a rapid change in brain size, brain structure, and brain capacity as well. So it's not just the brain that's physically changing, it's what the brain can do. So we're seeing very rapid cognitive and behavioural changes in our captive animals that can happen even across the course of one lifetime. And this causes problems. This causes lots of problems when we're thinking about reintroducing species. And even if we have an animal in a zoo and we're not realistically thinking of reintroducing it anytime soon, we still might want to reintroduce its progeny in many generations' time. But we're seeing things like weaker predator responses. We're seeing that animals don't know where the good food is, how to access the food. They don't know how to mate. We also know that these brain changes are connected to stereotypical behaviours, so they even affect an animal's welfare, and just a general loss of interest in the environment. So this might sound all quite anti-captivity, and I just want to reassure you that it's not. It's actually quite the opposite. Myself and my co-authors are very supportive of ex situ conservation and zoo-based conservation. So the key really is to think about what those environments are offering the animals. Are they challenging enough, rather than to just say, right, we're doing away with captivity. That is not the solution at all. What we're looking to do is try and introduce challenges. A challenge is an environmental change. And basically, captive environments, ex situ environments, suffer from being quite static. They don't change as much as a wild environment does. So the really tricky thing for people like me who work at this interface between cognition and welfare is how can you introduce a challenge to a captive animal but not cause distress? So we're looking to cause good stress. We're looking to cause a change and a challenge in the animal that's going to benefit them, that's going to help them develop skills, but it's not going to cause them sort of chronic welfare problems. And that balance is a really, really tricky one to find. And this taps back into my PhD, which was at ZSL. So this is a chimpanzee at Whipsnade Zoo. So I began looking at, like, how can you develop challenges that actually improve the animal's cognitive skills, but also have a good welfare benefit? And that can be a really tricky thing to do. Great, so that's the background. We've got this idea of the endangered brain. We want to try and challenge our captive animals' brains and make sure that they have these necessary skills so that theoretically, if we are to reintroduce them into the wild, wherever they're endemic to, they should have those skills that they need conserved. So we're not talking about reintroducing any lemurs like tomorrow or next week. This is more the sort of looking like 1 or 2 decades down the line. So, Lemur Boot Camp, it started about 2017, and the next few slides are going to show just how difficult it is to set up these new projects. The first thing that we had to do was we had to choose which type of lemur we wanted to focus on. So it was a little bit like running a game of lemur top trumps. We were sort of comparing all the lemur stats in front of us. And even though there are lemurs out there that are far more endangered than the ring-tailed lemur, we chose the ring-tailed lemur to focus on because it has lots of other benefits. It's very charismatic, which helped us actually get the funding to do the research. We were able to crowdfund it, so it was the public who actually paid for the research. They're doing pretty well in zoos as well. Relatively speaking, they're quite robust, so we had a nice big sample size. The next thing we had to do was try and focus on what type of cognition we were interested in. And the most obvious one was, can lemurs find food? So if we compare and contrast how a wild lemur would find food, or what it needs to find, where it needs to find it, and then we compare it to our lovely captive lemurs, there's quite a big difference that intuitively arises. You don't even need to do any research to just sort of look at these two pictures and go, okay, yeah, maybe the zoo lemur is a little bit more rotund, probably eating a little bit more sugar than he should be, and potentially doesn't have the nutritional wisdom that his wild counterparts do. These projects have been married together, as I said, for 7 odd years now, and I have my lovely academic family. So the common thread that connects us all is we all went to the University of Cambridge, which is a great place to go if you want to combine cognition and conservation. It's just one of those places that is very embraces that. So we started off with some literature, we did the endangered brain paper, and then we were looking to see what some of the challenges are to zoos when they try and combine cognition and conservation. And then all of that sort of background stuff led us to actually starting Lemur Boot Camp and working on that. So we created a challenge or a task for lemurs. We evaluated it, we designed it and fiddled around with it. We got it to the state that's pretty good, and then we started testing lemurs using that thing. So I'm going to tell you about my study site, and then I'm going to tell you about this thing, this challenge that we're going to give the lemurs. So I have a lovely study site. As you can see, this is not Bristol. This is Florida. So the Lemur Conservation Foundation near Tampa in Florida is a brilliant facility that has really large, humid pine forests. So yes, the lemurs are captive, but they're living in quite an expansive forest habitat. And Realistically, if we're going to start reintroducing animals like lemurs from ex situ back to in situ, back to where they originate from, we're looking at facilities like this as being the first type of facility that we would consider reintroducing from. A lot of the lemurs in Florida have these cool little radio collars, so when they're out in the forest you can track them, or you can tell which one's which because they've all got a different colour little radio collar. But this facility, it does have its downsides. So because of climate change, we've had a couple of very nasty tropical storms and hurricanes roll through that have made this research take a really, really, really long time. So I would like your sympathy, please. So here's just a couple of pictures of the design process. So we started off way too optimistic, way too expensive. I had this vision of like this big computerized radio-controlled tree with all these fancy feeding platforms, and obviously that got scaled back. We've done lots of research, lots of background research about how lemurs use their hands, what colours they can perceive, the types of materials they're willing to approach and touch, that sort of thing. We've done lots of research inside hurricane shelters when we couldn't go out and do our research in the forest. And then the final picture on the right shows you sort of the first prototype. So what we were working towards was to come up with an artificial tree. So what we're looking to do is to, as closely as possible, mimic a food patch or a source of vegetation that a lemur would be able to find food on, and then we can manipulate the fruit on that tree to look at exactly what information the lemurs are acting upon to find the food. So here we have it. This is our fake plastic tree. Again, this is meant to be forest-based, but because of climate change, because we've had such nasty storms, we've not actually managed to move it into the forest yet, but that's hopefully going to happen next year. So we've got our structure, that's our tree, and then we've got these circular things on it that are meant to be fruit, and they slide open, and behind these little circles, the lemurs will either find a food reward or they will find nothing because they chose the wrong one. Right. So, in terms of what we're looking at, we've already tested 3 different cognitive skills in our lemurs so far. We started off looking at whether they could just do very simple learning called associative learning. So this is where they could associate a colour with the presence of a real piece of fruit. But then, again, because of a hurricane, we had to pause our research for 3 months, but we took advantage of that and we tested long-term memory. So we came back once that storm had gone and we tested to see whether the lemurs could do the same thing again. So in this slide, the blue fruit is associated with a real reward, and the red fruit, they can't get the food reward out of that one. We also tested reversal learning. So this is the key one. If you have animals and they're living under high rec, these horrible rapid-induced human landscapes, you want them to be capable of reversal learning. Reversal learning is an indicator that the animal has cognitive flexibility, so it can bend and it can be dynamic and respond to anthropogenic changes. So that's the one that we were really hoping that our lemurs would be capable of doing. Okay, I'm going to try and play this little video for you. So this is sped up. The lemurs are not this quick, but this is just a little video to show you how the device works. The lemur has to slide open the door. So this lemur's doing pretty well at going for the correct ones, which in this trial are blue. So behind those blue doors, it will find a real piece of fruit that it can eat. The lemurs were tested in groups, and we found that they were very tolerant of each other. So even though ring-tailed lemurs have strong female dominance, which means you have a big dominant female and her close female friends, and they kind of monopolize whatever you give them, we didn't see any stealing, we didn't see any aggression around the device. But this did mean that we couldn't really collect any data on our male lemurs, because the male lemurs hang around and they scrounge, so they feed on the scraps that fall out of the device at the end. But overall, in the lemurs that we could assess, we found evidence for associative learning, so they're good at simple learning, you would hope so. They were also capable of long-term memory, which is a first for science. That's the first time that's ever been demonstrated in lemurs, so that's cool. But we didn't find reversal learning, so we didn't find evidence that these lemurs are very cognitively flexible, which is a big shame. I'm going to skip that because it's boring. So, yeah, in sum, I think, from what we've managed to do so far, we are seeing really positive signs that these captive lemurs have socially situated cognition. So that means within a social group, you have different cognitive strategies. So some lemurs are very good at foraging for food by colour. Some lemurs are not, but they're capable of feeding themselves anyway by scrounging. So even though they can't do the fancy thing, the fancy problem solving, they're still managing to feed themselves. So if we're thinking about reintroducing lemurs, it doesn't necessarily matter that they don't all have amazing complex cognition. As long as that skill belongs in the group and it's present in the group, we're thinking about reintroducing a group, then that's fine. So that's the message that we're kind of really trying to push with this research, that you have to look at cognition in the social context. So our lemurs have good basic cognition, they don't have flexible cognition, and that's the thing that we're going to focus on as we move forward with Lemur Bootcamp and start thinking about, can we train lemurs to have better cognitive skills using the same type of artificial tree apparatus? So in terms of the future, we have a huge, long to-do list. So if there's any students in the room or any funders in the room, and any of these take your fancy, please do come and speak to me at the end, because we're looking to roll this type of work out to other lemur groups, other lemur species, test lots of different things with this artificial tree setup. So yeah, the list is endless, really. But thank you. I'm sure I've taken too much of your time. So yes, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faye. I'm very happy that your lemurs are nice. My baboons are a lot more violent. But anyway, so I'll introduce Sam next. So Sam is professor here at IOZ, whose work focuses on evidence-based conservation to guide recovery of some of the world's most threatened species. Sam's work also investigates how different types of data can contribute unique insights for conservation, especially for species that are so rare they cannot be studied easily without standard ecological techniques. This research addresses biodiversity conservation in China and on fragile island ecosystems, which I'm very jealous of those, and aims to provide baselines for conserving neglected threatened species such as selenodons, hooteers, and giant salamanders. Difficult names, but yes. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's great to be here tonight. Like Faye, this is also my 20th year at ZSL, or being connected to ZSL, but unfortunately I don't have a nice slide showing my transition over the last 2 decades, which would probably just be me sitting at a desk getting progressively older. So anyway, I will talk to you tonight about conservation planning for a species which I've been working on for about 15 years now, the Hainan gibbon, and in particular where and how primate behaviour in particular fits into the picture of this long-term conservation story. So, as Simon kind of gazumped my background, I work on various different really highly threatened species in different contexts. So I'm not a primatologist per se, but one of the species I work on is a primate. And the different kinds of threatened species that I and others work on require a range of different conservation, management and mitigation strategies. These can vary from hands-off, in situ work to very, very potentially intensive ex situ conservation responses and reactions. And so given the range of different threats, the range of different human impacts to different biodiversity, different ecosystems, different species, it's crucial that we make the right conservation decisions about the right conservation management strategies we want to follow in different cases. And certainly from, again, in some of the particular scenarios I've worked on, in the past, there's been a risk of making conservation decisions based on what's called a precautionary approach, whereby you can rely, or conservation decisions have relied on well-intentioned, well-meaning assumptions which aren't necessarily grounded in real evidence and real science, real data, and they can come with a concomitant risk of potentially ineffective or misunderstood outcomes. So people might be doing conservation for what they think are the right reasons, but it might not lead to what you want. And so this is associated with the increasing recognition of the need for what's called evidence-based conservation, which is what's generally the gold standard now for guiding conservation action. So effective management and policy and decision-making is recognised that it needs to be guided by robust empirical data on key parameters that are relevant to conservation. So that can include a range of different sorts of baselines. So we might want to know about the status of the population we're talking about, how many individuals are there, what's its distribution, what are its trends and its population dynamics across space and across time, but also not just from the biological side of the equation, but also understanding what's causing it to be threatened, what are the human-wildlife interactions, human-landscape interactions, and the key threats that are operating in that system. So we want to have evidence, we want to have scientific data on all these different parts of the puzzle. And it's really important to focus research on conservation-relevant priority questions, because with threatened species, we have limited time and limited resources, so we really have to focus on what are the key things that we actually need to know. And we can think about this in terms of what are the key things we need to know that might help us to decide between different types of conservation responses or different types of management choices. And all threatened species really need an evidence-based approach. But the kind of species that I work on are often very, very, very tiny remnant populations on the very edge of extinction. And these can face unique new challenges which other threatened but slightly commoner species might not be addressing. So tiny populations are intrinsically, inherently vulnerable to extinction, not just from external threats like deforestation and hunting and poaching, but also simply by the fact they are very, very, very tiny populations. So they have stochastic risk of extinction. And this is illustrated by what's called the extinction vortex here, that if you have a very small population to begin with, just by processes such as inbreeding and genetic drift, you will lose genetic diversity, and that will decrease that population to be an even smaller size. And that process can, in theory, keep going towards extinction. Even if all hunting is removed, all deforestation, just the very vulnerability, the very fragility of that population status can potentially push it to extinction unaided. So for these really tiny populations, the conservation goals are not just to protect the surviving population, but also to really support and promote the recovery of that population so it stops being quite so on a knife edge. And we need evidence to support both of these related conservation goals. But the problem is, if we want to use a scientific approach to tiny population recovery, the paradox is the tiny populations that need it most are quite often the hardest to study and sometimes the hardest to even find. So how do we use scientific evidence to save species that need it the most? So sometimes standard ecological data isn't enough, and a lot of my work has drawn on non-standard alternative lines of evidence, like engaging with local people to draw on indigenous knowledge, or looking back at historical or even older archaeological or fossil archives. So that's the wider context for the priority, but the complexity and the problems facing these kind of conservation situations. So finally, I've got to animal behaviour. Where does animal behaviour fit into tiny population recovery? Well, sometimes it's absolutely core and key to the issue. And I'll illustrate this with this species, which maybe some of you have hopefully heard of. This is the paoli, which is a Hawaiian bird species, which was only discovered in the 70s, by which stage the population was already incredibly small. And that's why it took so long to discover, because it had been impacted by human activities already. By the 90s, there are only 3 surviving individuals known to survive, 1 male and 2 females. And there was a lot of debate and discussion what could be done to try and pull this species back from the brink, and it was increasingly realised that clearly intensive manipulation of these last individuals is required. So after 5 years of debate, one of the females was translocated into the male's territory, and these were birds on opposite sides of a mountain, so they'd never have found each other in the wild. They were too far apart. There was just these remnant individuals scattered across this large mountainous area. And so to try and encourage the only male to mate with one of the only 2 surviving females, they're actually physically brought into proximity with each other. So it was really hoped, fingers crossed, this would work. But the female bird, because of her behavioural tendencies, showed such strong sight fidelity to wanting to be in her home range that she flew all the way back around the mountain the next day. So this one attempt to try to save this species from extinction failed because of this unknown behavioural aspect that who knows how you would have accommodated it, possibly by bringing all the birds into captivity rather than trying to manipulate them in the wild. But it was behaviour that underpinned, unfortunately, the failure of this conservation effort. And shortly afterwards, the 2 female birds were never seen again. The male was brought into captivity and died shortly afterwards. So unfortunately, this species is now extinct. Unfortunately, partly, had we had a better handle on the behavioural aspects that would have underpinned its conservation, maybe there'd have been a different outcome. So for the rest of my talk, I want to talk about the Hainan gibbon, which is unfortunately quite close to the paoli in terms of its conservation status. So just for everyone who might not know what Hainan is, this is a global heat map of threatened mammalian species richness. And you can see that Eastern and Southeast Asia is really the global hotspot for threatened species. And Hainan Island is here. It's the southernmost province of China. And this is a zoom in on Hainan. And it shows the pale sort of cream colour shows 100 years ago the distribution of gibbons, as far as we can tell, across the island, based on old historical records. And the progressively warmer spots show the, as we go through time, the contracting geographic distribution of gibbons on Hainan. So by what's called current here, which is still the case today, you can see there's a tiny spot within that green polygon, which is the only site anywhere in the world where this endemic island species still persists. And this progressive contraction and fragmentation of the gibbon population was caused by huge amounts of deforestation and associated increased access for hunters and poachers. So it's this kind of double whammy of habitat loss and increased exploitation. Because gibbons were traditionally used for medicine and food in Hainanese communities. Apparently, if you boil the whole gibbon up into a paste, it's a potent tonic. So this is one of those pictures that speaks 1,000 words. This was, at the time I took the photo, a view of the entire geographic distribution of the Hainan gibbon. This is me standing on a roadside at the edge of what was then called Bawangling National Nature Reserve, which has now been subsumed into Hainan Tropical Rainforest National Park. And that mountain ridge, Futoling Ridge, is the entire geographic distribution of this species. Since then, the population has expanded slightly, but that just shows just how perilous the situation was. And this is a plot through time showing, as far as we know, to the best of our understanding, the status of this species. So it goes from 1980 up to 2020, or just afterwards on the x-axis at the bottom. And on the y-axis on the left is the population size. So it was estimated in the late 70s there may have been as few as 7 surviving individuals because the species has been so heavily poached. The population slowly built up again. There was another big poaching event and it crashed down to about 10 individuals, slowly built up again. Another poaching event, crashed down to about 10. It's now about 40 or so individuals. So whilst the population is recovering, it is absolutely on a knife edge. It's the world's rarest primate species, contender for the world's rarest mammal species. And this is just a plot showing the rates of those three different consecutive recovery trajectories over time. Each time the population has bounced back, it has recovered more slowly. Is this because of progressive genetic deterioration and erosion of the population? Is it because at each new starting point there were different numbers of reproductively viable females? We just don't know. Or maybe more hopefully, is it because this latest recovery trajectory has carried on for longer, so maybe the population is actually reaching saturation in that bit of forest it's in, so there's less room for growth, which is not a great thing, but it might actually not mean the population is so genetically eroded. So, a lot of issues there, a lot of urgency. So from my perspective, the key thing we need to find out in order to help save this species is what are the factors that are regulating or limiting the population recovery of the Hainan gibbon. And unpicking this question, I think, is key to working out if we know what is either stopping or promoting population growth, we can then translate that knowledge into different management actions on the ground and really promote the things that might promote growth and reduce the issues that might be holding back that recovery. Which sounds sensible, so what do you do? Thinking about it, there's lots of different things that might come into play. So I've just sort of mapped this out a bit here to try and unpick some of the complexity we're dealing with. Is the gibbon population recovery limited by what I've called intrinsic factors? So demographic parameters of the population, say the numbers of reproductively viable females, the age structure of the population, the social group structure. Something to do with the genetic factor, the level of inbreeding, the homozygous deleterious alleles that might be being expressed in the population. Or are aspects of the population's behaviour coming into play? And or are there environmental issues? Is the forest structure, the forest quality, the resource availability, is that a limiting factor? Is that the limiting factor? And or are anthropogenic factors, human-caused habitat change, habitat destruction, disturbance by people going into the forest, how much is that regulating and limiting gibbon recovery? And or what combination of all of these factors are involved? Are certain ones key? Is there one that's key? Are there multiple? And we need to think both about what's going on now and what's going on in the future. What effect might climate change have on the distribution of gibbons, their relationship and their interactions with their required habitat, such as the distribution and availability of food plants? So what started off as, to me, a core research question suddenly maps out into this much more complicated mess. And that was all just looking from a kind of more biological, ecological side. The landscape where these gibbons live, the mountains in the background, are also occupied by indigenous Liu Miao ethnic minority communities who are heavily marginalised and need this landscape for their livelihoods. So we need to employ interdisciplinary approaches, not just to understand the ecological side of the equation, but also the social side, humanities side of the equation. What are the sustainable solutions for both gibbons and human well-being in this landscape? So, as you can see, behaviour is in here, and I've sort of slightly artificially cornered it in there because it does feed back across all of these parameters, but it's part of the equation. What can we do as regards behaviour? So we've been working on Hainan gibbons here at ZSL since about 2010, and we've investigated various different sort of aspects of the puzzle. We've looked at what's the habitat use, home range requirements. We've looked at genetics using historical specimens with scat collected from wild populations. And we've engaged with indigenous communities to understand their knowledge about the species and what's their pattern and behaviour of landscape and habitat use and how might that be impacting gibbon populations. From a behavioural perspective, I think these are maybe some of the key questions that we'd want to understand. What behavioural factors are there that regulate mate choice and social group formation in this species? So the factors that might sort of promote reproduction. So gibbons, they don't just sort of mate one-on-one. There's a kind of there's sort of the social group, the family unit is the unit of reproduction in a sense. So that as more social groups come in the landscape, the population sort of recovers that way. So how are gibbons choosing or failing to choose mates? And why are they, under certain conditions, forming new social groups and in other certain conditions not doing so? How does competition between different social groups across the landscape regulate the distribution of the gibbons across the forest and the number and extent of home ranges there? And how do gibbons select new bits of the landscape that they want to occupy and they want to form a new home range in? What are the environmental cues that make them think this bit of the landscape is where we want to go? We might want to travel across this other bit to get to somewhere else. I think those are almost, to me, some of the key factors that might be underpinning the species recovery, which are all very, very behaviourally based. So, what do we know about any of these? Absolutely no idea whatsoever, which I would argue is a problem. In fact, there's been very little behavioural work done on Hainan gibbons. Pretty much the only paper I'm aware of that's sort of interest is this one from a couple of years ago, which showed that Hainan gibbons like to juggle sticks, which is interesting, but maybe isn't the most conservation priority research that will help us understand how to save the species. The problem we have is that if we want to understand the relationship between behaviour and gibbon recovery, is that we're largely limited to the analysis of indirect data. Because of logistic and political barriers to working directly in this landscape, we can't easily do long-term intensive behavioural-based fieldwork. So this is the problem. So we're kind of restricted to thinking about these problems more indirectly. So, for example, this is a map, a remote sensing map showing the different habitat types across the gibbon landscape. The white dots show records of gibbons based on field surveys to look for where they are. So there's kind of, you can see the distribution of two different social groups and how they use the landscape there. And so one of the approaches we're hoping to explore is what's going on in the places where the gibbons are and what's going on in the places where the gibbons aren't in terms of landscape structure, forest structure. How much can we infer indirectly some of these behavioural underpinnings that might help us understand what's stopping the gibbons being in other places? And how do we even monitor the population and collect data to understand the behavioural dynamics? This itself is a challenge. Traditionally, the gibbons have been studied by by getting up before dawn, climbing up into the mountain if you're legally allowed in, listening for the calls, running towards where the calls are before dawn over a mountain, trying to find them, watching them for as long as you can before they disappear off into the canopy, which has obviously issues associated with it. So we've been exploring other approaches such as passive acoustic monitoring. Can we detect gibbons in general if we put recording devices in the forest? Can we differentiate separate gibbon groups? Can we distinguish specific individuals? To some degree. The more resolution we get on this, the better we can understand the behavioural underpinnings of population recovery, but we're not there yet. We're also exploring, or our colleagues in China are exploring the use of arboreal camera traps and even drones to provide that more real-time monitoring of the gibbons in the forest. But again, this is not a straightforward exercise to do. And we've also been thinking a lot about emergency response planning for the species. So at the moment, the population has been undergoing this third slow recovery trajectory to about 40 or so individuals, but it's clearly still in a very perilous situation. What happens if there's a catastrophe? What do we do? Possibly we might want to try things like supplementary feeding, using these kind of feeding approaches which have been trialled and worked effectively for other gibbons. Do we know if this will work for Hainan gibbons? We do not know that. Either for the species behaviour, it might differ from the behaviour of other gibbons, but also in the particular landscape that it's in, at that low population density, will they want to come near humans? All of those sort of behavioural related factors, we don't have any baseline on at all. So clearly behaviour is crucial to how we might respond if the population undergoes a further decline, but we don't have that baseline either. So just to sort of wrap up, hopefully that wasn't too spectacularly depressing. I think the take-home message I was trying to get at is that for these kind of critical, urgent conservation scenarios, it's actually, there's a complex network of related, interrelated, complementary, different sort of questions and topics. We need to understand all of this now in order to have a good shot at saving this species. Behaviour is part of it. It's one of the many research areas that we need to have better evidence for to understand how or whether it's a key limiting factor in gibbon recovery dynamics. It may operate on its own or synergistically with other factors. Behavioural issues may well be key to enhancing Hainan gibbon recovery. And really, we need to overcome the current barriers that exist to improving our knowledge of Hainan gibbon behaviour from a conservation perspective. And I think, obviously, this is a kind of sort of bespoke case study system that I've got particular experience with. But I'd probably suggest that for species which are on the very edge of extinction, but for which, paradoxically, we don't really have enough baseline data, this is probably quite similar to a lot of other species out there, that we know behaviour, especially for kind of birds and mammals, will be a key component to how they use the landscape and how the recovery might be limited. But very often we don't have the information, and we need to be getting that information in tandem with lots of other information as well. So I will leave it there, and I will just thank the Arcus Foundation, who have kindly funded pretty much all of our work on this species. So the little that we do know is thanks to them. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Sam. So we now have our Q&A session, so if you guys would like to pop on there. So we have a handheld mic going around the room with Harriet, just for the sake of everyone on YouTube and hearing us out, if you can wait till that is passed to you to ask your question. But I guess I can kick us off with the first question while you're kind of ponder your thoughts. Are these, yeah. I was going to ask Faye. Yeah, you were saying about your lemurs, they couldn't do the reversal learning, but they could do the other two. What would your thoughts be if they couldn't do those other two things for candidates for reintroduction?
So if they weren't capable of the very basic learning.
I won't speak ill of our lemurs here, but ours weren't very good at some of the stuff. Yeah.
Oh, I think we'd be running in there immediately trying to train that skill, because that would be terrible, actually. So very, very more simplistic life forms are capable of associative learning. So even slime mold is capable of associative learning. So if lemurs didn't have that ability, we'd probably assume that we'd messed up experimentally, I think. So it was a relief that we found that. Yeah, you're not going to get very far without associative learning, I would say, in life.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go down there. So feel free to ask me as well. But yes.
I was just wondering, how much do you think you can analogize between different species, particularly similar species, and if worse comes to worse, can you base behavioural decisions on how similar, for example, gibbon species behave and learn?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's almost the sort of feedback, sort of tip of the iceberg more generally about conservation issues around tiny populations, that given that not just for behaviour but for so many other factors like ecological, habitat usage, all of those kind of parameters, response, vulnerability, resilience to different kind of threat processes, if we don't have information for one species, can we draw it from others? And again, in some senses, it's case-by-case basis, because each species differs from other species in a different way. That's why they are all different. Probably for behaviour, for all of those different factors, but behaviour definitely within that, I think that it's not just on a species-by-species level, but also on a kind of context-by-context level, so that how populations different populations of the same species may respond differently in behaviour in different contexts. Also, if you have, say, very low density versus high density, hunted versus non-hunted, those kind of intrinsic and extrinsic variables might alter certain key behaviours in all kinds of ways. So probably it's a very complex one. There is transferability, but almost in a bespoke way, I suppose.
Have you tried actually splitting the groups up into male and female? Because as I remember, males in groups are notably bad at learning things themselves and either copy or steal. And I was thinking particularly of the Japanese monkeys, the ones that learnt to wash potatoes, and it was the females that learnt to wash potatoes, and the old males never learnt to wash potatoes because it was beneath their dignity to do so. So I wondered whether, splitting your test groups up into male and female to see what happened would be a way of sort of encouraging the males to be a little bit better.
Yeah, it would be. I think we're very reluctant to do that. So it was always our intention with Lemur Bootcamp that we were going to work with social groups and that we were going to work with untrained, naive animals. So you'll notice that what we don't do is train up the animal incrementally how to do the puzzle. The puzzle is just there, and we naturally watch what happens. The reason we don't want to separate those lemurs, well, there's two reasons. The first is the ethics of doing so. So if you have animals that live in a social group in a zoo, and then you isolate them for cognitive testing, there's a lot of ethical concerns about doing that. The animals could become stressed. They could assume that the vet's on his way, because that's usually why animals are separated from their conspecifics. And the second reason gets back to what I was talking about socially situated cognition. So if we're thinking that realistically we're going to reintroduce groups of lemurs, we're not going to introduce one lemur, we're going to introduce a social troop. We want to see how cognition acts at a group level. So yes, if we took that male away and we tested his cognition, the likelihood is that his cognitive skills might be a little bit more impressive without those bully females around, but that's not relevant to what we're imagining that we would do. We would never release a single male. So even if he is by himself, that would kind of be quite an artificial situation to test him in. So. No, we don't. We don't have any intentions on giving the males any help, unfortunately.
Okay.
Anyone else? Going once. No tries. Okay, well, if there's no follow-ups, feel free to catch us as we kind of filter out if you don't feel comfortable voicing questions in a big crowded room. That's totally fine. But other than that, I guess, yeah. Thank you all for coming, unless there's anything else. No? Oh, good. Okay.